Amy Goodman is an investigative journalist, author, and co-host of the independent internet news program Democracy Now! Since its founding in 1996, Democracy Now! Has amassed widespread acclaim, airing on over 1,400 public television and radio stations around the world without any government funding, corporate sponsorship, underwriting, or advertising revenue. Amy Goodman began her investigative journalism career in 1991 and is widely known for her award-winning reporting on the East Timor independence movement and the Dakota Access Pipeline protests. Goodman is also the author of 6 books. Her most recent work, Democracy Now! 20 Years Covering the Movements Changing America, pays tribute to progressive heroes and movements that have been often ignored by the corporate media. Amy Goodman has earned a number of awards for her work, including the George Polk Award and the I.F. Stone Medal for Journalistic Independence.
Of course, this event could not have been possible without the generous support of our sponsors, including the Office of Student Life, the Parents Fund, the President's Office, and the Alumni Association. In addition, we would like to give a special shout out to our advisor, Calvin Smith, the staff at Student Leadership and Involvement, and countless others who have given us their time and advice this year. Tonight's event is the second in what promises to be a dynamic series. On March 18th, we will be hosting No Name, a rapper and poet from Chicago. Our next event, on April 6th, will feature Uyghur activists Nuri Turkal, Louisa Grev, and Roshan Abbas for a conversation on the global response to the Uyghur crisis. Finally, we will welcome Angela Davis, activist, scholar, and author, to campus virtually on April 22nd.
Tonight's event will feature a keynote address, followed by a moderated discussion, and finally 20 minutes of audience Q&A. When the time comes, we will ask you to submit any questions you have for Amy through the Zoom webinar Q&A function. Without further ado, we're proud to introduce Amy Goodman.
Well, it's absolutely wonderful to be with all of you. Thank you so much to Ryan and to Margaret, to Calvin, to the whole Johns Hopkins community that has come out, and to people all over the globe, perhaps, who are watching this. Maybe the silver lining of the pandemic, and it is so utterly painful to think of anything positive, it's hard, is that we are all together in this very strange way. It does not make up for being together person to person, but at this point, it is a way we can communicate with people all over the world, which really what Democracy Now! Is all about. It's a great honor to be with you on the 25th anniversary of Democracy Now! We were formed in 1996 as the only daily election show in public broadcasting. We were on 9 community radio stations. We were going to last for 9 months. It was the second election of President Clinton, and we were going to pack up and be finished. But the day after the election, stations were saying there's more interest now for Democracy Now! Than there had ever been. And so we continued, and more at the time, radio stations picked us up. Now, I should say, just to give you all some background, and I'm a deep believer in history, we're an independent television radio show, an embedded, independent, investigative, international news hour, believing that the power of people speaking for themselves, well, let's just say there is nothing more powerful. But we came out of Pacifica Radio, which was established in 1949 in Berkeley, California. A war resistor named Lou Hill, when he came out of the detention camps, this was in 1949, said there's got to be a media outlet that's not run by corporations that profit from war, but run by journalists and artists. And that's how Pacifica was born. The first station in 49, KPFA in Berkeley. Second station, KPFK in Los Angeles. Third station, my station here, I'm in New York City, WBAI. In 1960. In 1970, KPFT in Houston, Texas went on the air in the Petro Metro, so hard hit recently by that winter storm. And the absolutely failed fossil fuel grid that Texas depends on. And then the last station, WPFW in Washington, DC. That's the Pacifica family. That is not brought to you by weapons manufacturers when we talk about war and peace, not brought to you by oil, gas, and coal companies when we talk about climate change, not brought to you by the insurance industry when we talk about healthcare, not brought to you by the banks or the financial institutions when we talk about the growing inequality in this country and the world, but brought to you by listeners and now viewers like you and not like you, who do have something in common, deeply committed to independent free speech media. So in 1970, when the station in Houston went on the air, KPFT, it was blown off the air within a few weeks. It was the Ku Klux Klan. They strapped dynamite to the base of the transmitter and blew it to smithereens. They got back on their feet, they rebuilt the transmitter, and within a few weeks, the Klan strapped 15 times the dynamite to the base of the transmitter and blew it up again. Now it took months, but in January of 1971, the phoenix rose from the ashes and KPFT went back on the air again. I can't remember if it was the Grand Dragon or the Exalted Cyclops. I often confuse their titles. But he said it was his proudest act. And that's because he understood the power of people speaking for themselves. When you hear a Palestinian child or an Israeli grandmother, an aunt in Afghanistan or an uncle in Iraq, you don't have to agree with them, but you might say, it sounds like my aunt, my uncle, my mother, my child. And you may not even like your aunt or your uncle, but you begin to understand where that person is coming from, who's speaking for themselves. And it makes it much less likely that you'll want to destroy them, right? Hearing someone speak for themselves breaks down stereotypes and caricatures that fuel the hate groups like the KKK. I think the media can be the greatest force for peace on earth. Instead, all too often, it's wielded as a weapon of war. And that's why we have to take the media back. Why the media and democracy movement is as critical to the pro-democracy movements in this country and other countries as any other movement. We are all in this together. It is critical we have a democratic media where people can describe their own situations. I see the media as a huge kitchen table that stretches across the globe, that we all sit around and debate and discuss the most important issues of the day. War and peace, life and death, and anything less than that is a disservice to a democratic society. I believe it's why President Trump targeted the media, just like back in the bombing of KPFT. He, like the Klan, understood the power of people communicating with each other. And so he came to represent, both metaphorically and literally, a wall. Stop people from seeing each other. Build walls, stop people from coming into this country, institute a Muslim ban, stop people from coming from other countries. And why the media is so critical in breaking down those barriers, because in fact, we know no borders. We are global, and that is a media that preserves a democratic society. And so Democracy Now! Began on the 9 stations in 1996. We became an independent nonprofit outside of Pacifica, but broadcast on those stations. A year later, I'd like to say we grew to 20 stations, but in 1997, 24 years ago, we were broadcasting, and we saw that NPR had gone into a prison in Pennsylvania to record the commentaries of the prisoner, the former Black Panther, Mumia Abu-Jamal, who is the head of the local chapter of the National Association of Black Journalists, who was on death row. And they were going to run these commentaries. The editor at All Things Considered said they were some of the finest commentaries she had ever heard on any issue. But then the Fraternal Order of Police waged a campaign to make sure that NPR did not run those commentaries, and they ultimately locked them away in a safe. And that's where we felt at Democracy Now! We had to step up. We had to preserve that idea that the media is there for people to make their own decisions, that if we're going to talk about criminal justice, we need to hear from people on both sides of the bars. If we're going to talk about the death penalty, we have to go behind the bars that are behind the bars and hear from people on death row. I mean, how many people on death row have been exonerated? And so we went in working with the Prison Radio Project and recorded Mumia Abu-Jamal commentaries. And we actually did broadcast them. Sadly, we lost the network that was broadcasting Democracy Now! In Pennsylvania. They didn't want to admit the truth at that time. And they said, well, there was just a surge of demand for jazz. The day we started running Mumia's commentaries was the day they took us off the air. They had a problem, though, because their program guide had already gone out. And it said that Democracy Now! Was the most successful program they had on their network and that they were using as a model for other shows. And we understood. The dean at the time, it was affiliated with the school, it was called Jazz FM, said that it was inappropriate to air Mumia Abu-Jamal's voice. We are not there to win a popularity contest. We are there to take on the critical issues of the day and to hash them out. Mumia Abu-Jamal never talked about his own case in his commentaries. Instead, he talked about father hunger, how many young men in prison that he met were turning to him as a father figure. And he couldn't be a father or grandfather to his own children and grandchildren as he was locked away. He talked about capital punishment being punishment for those without capital. His commentaries were extremely powerful. And we continued to run them. We had the Society of Professional Journalists on. All these journalistic organizations, quite mainstream, were all supporting what we were doing. And while we lost that network, and then there were big forums held at Temple University Law School and to decry censorship, and we spoke at some of these, then Democracy Now! Just started being picked up by stations all over the country, radio stations at the time, NPR stations, college stations, community stations, and then all over the world. And 5 years later, the week of September 11th, the week of the terror attacks, 2001, coincidentally, we were starting on one TV station in New York, a public access TV station, Manhattan Neighborhood Network. We were broadcasting out of an old firehouse TV studio called Downtown Community Television. The attacks happened on the World Trade Center. We were the closest national broadcast to Ground Zero. We broadcast all that day, did not know what was happening, but just continued to describe. And from that moment, we stayed in the firehouse. We were inside the evacuation zone and knew it was critical that we broadcast the voices of those we were hearing, because it was very different than the rest of the media, which sounded like a battle cry and certainly different than the Bush administration in Washington, D.C. It wasn't a battle cry. People were congregating, holding candles. People were trying to understand what had taken place and putting up those signs that became so famous. Have you seen my grandchild? Have you seen my mother? Have you seen my wife, my partner, my husband? Last seen in Tower 1 or Tower 2. And I thought about how similar those signs were to those carried by the mothers of the disappeared in Argentina. Have you seen my grandchild? Have you seen my grandson? September 11th united us with victims of terror all over the world. And it wasn't the only September 11th where terror was known. September 11th, 1973 in Chile, Salvador Allende dies in the palace as the Pinochet forces, sadly, the US-backed Pinochet forces, rose to power there. Myrna Mack, the Guatemalan anthropologist, September 11th, 1991, was killed by Guatemalan security forces in Guatemala, the US-backed Guatemalan security forces. Steve Biko, leader of the Black nationalist movement in 1977, was beaten to death in the back of apartheid forces van. as he took on injustice in South Africa. No, September 11th had known terror before. And it was absolutely critical. We talk about all of this as we dealt with the horror of 3,000 people who died. And at that time, the show on television then was on public access stations. We were sending out, at the time, video cassettes by FedEx so that people could get it. We said it was breaking news as fast as they could. And then it grew to more than 1,500 stations. And every week, another station picks us up. On radio, on television, our headlines also available in Spanish. And I think the reason for this hunger for independent voices is what we're seeing today. I talked about President Trump representing a wall. Well, this is an absolutely critical time because as Trump lost the election, and yes, as you know, he lost by more than 7 million votes. And no, he wasn't inaugurated today, March 4th, some crazy QAnon theory that he would be inaugurated in Washington, D.C., why the House was canceled today, the House of Representatives, because there was so much chatter that there could be violence, that one of these white supremacist, extreme right-wing groups might attack the Capitol, that they had to cancel their session today. The Senate continued. But I think President Trump represented a wall. And now that wall is a door, the Biden-Harris administration. I'm not saying the door is open. I think the door is closed, but it's not locked. The question of whether that door is kicked open or remains shut is up to movements, is up to all of the movements we have seen gain so much power in these last years. This is a moment of great instability, but it's also a time when those movements can be heard. I mean, think what we're moving into. Monday is March 8th, International Working Women's Day all over the world. It's also the day that Derek Chauvin will be the beginning of his trial. Responsible, the man who's been, who I think most everyone who is watching this right now, the Minneapolis police officer who kneeled on the neck of George Floyd. And there's going to be actions all weekend leading up to that trial in the Twin Cities. And you think about what happened after that on Memorial Day. I mean, the midst of this pandemic, as people are separated or isolated to protect each other and to protect themselves, if they can, unless they're essential workers, people who could not protect themselves or protect each other, that we all must protect together. People went out into the streets. The Black Lives Matter was there in force, had such a massive effect on this country and the world. Connecting so many different issues, highlighting racism, inequality, police brutality. And here I'm speaking to you today on March 4th, a day after the House just passed two major pieces of legislation. The For the People HR 1, House Resolution 1, the first act that was voted, that the House voted for, which fights voter suppression all over this country. You know, you never achieve democracy. You have to fight for it every day. This week, the Supreme Court heard 2 Arizona cases around voter suppression. It doesn't look good for the voter empowerment movement, the way they questioned the lawyers. But at the same time, this legislation that would open access to voting has passed the House, though it now has to go to the Senate. And the George Floyd Police Reform Act passed. which goes to the issue of police accountability. Tomorrow on Democracy Now!, and I hope everyone watches Democracy Now!. You can go to democracynow.org. Maybe you see it on local television or radio stations, or on YouTube. And of course, we're all over social media. But each day, each weekday, we're a daily hour of grassroots voices of people speaking for themselves. Tomorrow, we'll be speaking with Reverend Barber. And you all know repairers of the breach. You all know this world-renowned Reverend from North Carolina who took up the mantle of the Poor People's March, and continues to fight that fight that Dr. King took on and so many others took on. And we're going to be speaking with Mondaire Jones, who is one of two of the first African-American openly gay congressmen. He represents New York, who wants to talk about everything from these two acts that I've referred to fighting to eliminate student debt. And we're going to end with Mariama Kaba, who takes on the whole issue of the defund police movement and has just written a remarkable book that's already hit the New York Times bestseller list. It's always wonderful to see a grassroots, longtime grassroots activist, one of the leaders in the Me Too movement, who is now being read by people all over. These are the movements that make a difference. These are the movements that need to be covered by media that is open and honest and provides a forum for people to speak for themselves. Because I really do think that those who care about war and peace, those who care about climate change, those who care about the growing inequality in the world, and those who care about LGBTQ issues, about racial and economic justice, are not a fringe minority, not even a silent majority, but the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate media. And this is very critical. All of these movements that are so active all over the planet rarely hit the corporate media radar screen at the beginning, which is why it's our job to go to where the silence is. It's not really silent. It is raucous, it is loud, people are debating and discussing issues, people are marching in the streets. But their voice, your voices, must be heard, and there must be a media outlet for them. There must be media all over that gives voice, that opens up the discussion. Because right now, which way the Biden administration goes is going to depend on those voices being heard. You know, Naomi Klein wrote the book, The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. In a time of great disorientation, what counts are the ideas that are being discussed at this moment. And I'll just end by saying, we're dealing with global crises right now, this horrific pandemic, where it is hard to believe that we live in the wealthiest country on earth, but we have the worst death rate and the worst infection rate, about 20%. It used to be a quarter of the world's death rate and infection rate, but we have less than 5% of the world's population. How is that possible? When you deny facts, when you deny science, when you look at what this country has been through over the last few years, that's how it's possible. And it matters to the whole world. Now, vaccines are being circulated in the United States. There are more and more of them. President Biden says anyone who wants a vaccine, an adult, may be vaccinated by the end of May. We will see. But we also have to look globally. As we care about equality in this country and equity, we have to look at vaccine equity in the world and who gets treatments, who gets vaccines in the world. We cannot further a global vaccine apartheid. We just had a guest on Democracy Now! Named Craig Spencer, a doctor who had Ebola himself when he was working in Western Africa a few years ago, taking on the Ebola epidemic. And he now heads a global health division at Columbia University and is an emergency room doctor. He said he was one of the first to get a vaccine here as a frontline doctor. He said those 2 doses that he got in his arm were more than 130 countries have gotten to date. More than 130 countries. If the pandemic has taught us anything, if anyone is sick anywhere in the world, we are all threatened. It is absolutely critical we take a global view of this scourge that we have not seen in something like a century. I'm going to end on that note by saying that we need a global media that looks at these issues globally, whether we're talking about the pandemic or whether we're talking about the absolute catastrophe that is the climate crisis. But what gives me the most hope is young people all over the world on the front line of the climate crisis, of the racial justice movement, who have taught us so much in these last years about what it means when people gather together. That's what true power, meaningful power, is all about. It's, well, Democracy Now! Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Amy, for the insightful overview of Democracy Now!'s history and the international importance of independent media. We will now be transitioning to a moderated Q&A discussion for roughly 20 minutes. In the meantime, audience members are free to submit questions through the Zoom webinar's Q&A function, which should be located on the bottom right of your screen. Please limit your questions to this function as we will not be monitoring the chat. With that being said, our first question is as follows. In one of your books, Breaking the Sound Barrier, you have described your work as trying to, quote, go beyond the 9-second soundbite to bring us a taste of the whole meal. Anything less than that, you continue, is a disservice to a democratic society. What aspects of the American mainstream media do you think fall short in terms of fostering the dialogue and critical analysis that is so important to democratic governance?
Great question, Ryan. I guess I see our job as journalists as storytellers, and I'm going to tell one story to answer that question. How does the corporate media fall short? I want to talk about Standing Rock. And I think there is a through line right through today to what has to happen in the future. And it is the power of Indigenous organizing in this country and how little coverage that got in the corporate media. Let's go back to 2016. I'm going to talk super fast because I know we don't have much time and I want to hear from as many people as we can. 2016, this is the presidential race that ends up being between Trump and Hillary Clinton. So that election year is happening and we are seeing something epic unfold in North Dakota. April 1st, the unofficial historian of the Standing Rock Sioux, LaDonna Brave Bull Allard, opens up her property along the Cannonball River and says, a company, Energy Transfer Partners, is building the Dakota Access Pipeline, DAPL, right next to our reservation. And we want this stopped. I invite anyone to come from all over the world and help us stop this. She thought a few dozen people would come. Well, I'm sure many of you know the story of the standoff at Standing Rock, but dozens and hundreds and thousands of people came, Indigenous people from Latin America, from the United States, First Nations and Canada, allies from all over the world came. They set up all different resistance camps, the Red Warrior Camp, hers was the Sacred Stone Camp and others, and they took on Energy Transfer Partners. This was an epic battle. Where was the corporate media? We were covering it from New York, from afar. But I mean, in the presidential debates at that time, 2016, that, with the corporate media stars asking the questions, there was not one question asked about climate change, let alone the standoff at Standing Rock. We get to North Dakota Labor Day weekend of 2016, and we are covering these epic protests. And in one area, a group of indigenous people went to plant their flags in an area that they considered sacred land. And then they saw bulldozers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, digging up the land. This was sacred land. In fact, the judge was going to rule on it a few days later. And they weren't supposed to be there. And these are vast earth-crushing machines. And the people came up onto the property. Women, girls, boys, men started standing in front of the bulldozers. We were filming all of this. And the bulldozers started to pull back. And then the Dakota Access Pipeline guards, the DAPO guards, unleashed dogs on the protesters. They didn't call themselves protesters. They called themselves water protectors, because DAPO would go under the Missouri River, the longest river in North America, imperiling the water supply, they said, of like 17 million people downstream. But they would not stop. They kept standing in front of the bulldozers until they pulled back. But the security guards unleashed dogs, and the dogs were biting the water protectors. We filmed a dog with its mouth and nose covered with blood. Dogs biting Native American water protectors. And finally, the bulldozers pulled back, and ultimately the people prevailed. They were bitten, they were beaten, they were maced, they were pepper sprayed, but they prevailed that day. We posted the video online that night. Within 24, 48 hours, something like 14 million views. And we had to go back to New York. The judge was going to rule on the following Friday. On Thursday, the North Dakota governor called out the National Guard because of the judge's ruling. And also quietly, authorities in North Dakota had issued an arrest warrant for me. I didn't know it at the time. The next day, my colleague and I, Nermeen Sheikh, and I were going to the Toronto International Film Festival because there was a film about a great muckraking journalist named I.F. Stone, who deeply believed in challenging those in power. And then they were looking at media outlets that today are similar to what he was doing then. So they asked us to come and speak. And the film is called, well, he said, if you can remember two things, the I.F. Stone muckraking journalist said, remember, governments lie. If you can remember two words, governments lie. If you can remember three words, remember, all governments lie. And that was the name of the film. So I was giving a talk at the University of Toronto the next day, and then I got a message on my phone. It said, you're under arrest. I thought it was one of the kids, one of the students had hacked my phone, but I saw it was a North Dakota number. And that's when I learned there was an arrest warrant for me. I raced back to the United States so I could get back into the country. I knew I wouldn't necessarily be arrested right away, but if I deal with border guards or police or the FBI, then I would be picked up. I was able to get back. And when we came back to the United States, a few weeks later, we flew back to challenge this arrest warrant. What? I'm charged with riot. I'm a one-woman riot. Why? Because we filmed, we showed the images of what was happening on the ground. When we arrived back in North Dakota, we learned they dropped the arrest warrant. I felt it was critical, especially for young people, to know that if you're a journalist and you want to cover a historic struggle like this, you do not have to worry about being arrested. We had to challenge this arrest warrant. So we went back. We were going to be arraigned. We did the broadcast from right outside the courthouse in the jail. But because of the media attention on a journalist being arrested, we were the homepage of the BBC, Vogue magazine, the New York Times, Al Jazeera, the New York Times. They dropped even before I was being arraigned, they decided to drop all charges. And more importantly, Native Americans who faced misdemeanor and felony charges were going to court that day. They had their charges dropped. And I'll just end by saying, this is what happens when you shine a light in the right direction. I don't believe in the reality TV that Donald Trump was a part of, but I do believe in real reality TV, the media that shows the reality of people's lives on the ground. And the only way to do that is to have them speak for themselves. That's the kind of media we have to build all over this country and around the world.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Amy, for such an awesome answer. Sort of on the same note of shining a light on the right information in the media, we have a question on the growing crisis of misinformation. So from coronavirus denial to QAnon, conspiratorial thinking has become increasingly weaponized for political purposes in recent years. With virtually every news narrative and mainstream institution now a target for such theories, what role do you believe the independent media must play to address the crisis of disinformation?
An absolutely critical role. And it's not just about, QAnon. It's not just about the white supremacist movements and putting out lies and about challenging the hate. It's also taking on power. We don't occupy a comfortable position as journalists. We have to challenge those in power, whether we're talking about a Republican president like President Trump, or whether we're talking about the current administration, which is a Democratic administration. Our job is to challenge those in power. And as I.F. Stone said, governments lie. All governments lie. And we have to show the reality of what's happening on the ground and challenge what is being described to us by governments. But not only that, it's not just us that have to do that. On Democracy Now!, again, it's people who are talking about what it means to be at the target end of policy. And that's the kind of media that we have to build.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And just to allot more time for audience members to ask their questions, we will have this be our last question for the prepared Q&A portion and then transition to audience Q&A. With that being said, the question is, you've said that you believe in the media can be the greatest force for peace on earth. In an ideal world, what would the media landscape look like? And what are the steps that we can take towards this?
Repeat that question. What would
the media landscape look like in this ideal world where the media can be the greatest force for peace on earth? What are the exact steps that we can take towards this future?
Well, I deeply believe we need independent media. And as I said before, when you're breaking every 5 or 6 minutes for commercials of the weapons manufacturers, of the oil, gas, and coal companies, of the insurance industry, for example, when we're covering healthcare. Let's use that as an example. This year, there's been enormous focus in the media on the pandemic, as there should be. There cannot be enough. And what the pandemic has shown us is it has exposed the fissures in the system, the inequality, the lack of access to healthcare, for example, in this country. Why is it? How can it be that while the virus, is an equal opportunity attacker, African Americans die and the Latinx population, indigenous people, are dying at such higher rates? It is about a story that starts before the pandemic. It's who has access to healthcare and who doesn't. I mean, as I said earlier, we're the wealthiest country in the world, yet in most of the industrialized world, there is healthcare for all. There is a basic guarantee of healthcare for all. And that's what this pandemic has exposed. When was the last time you saw on one of the corporate networks a deep discussion? And I don't mean just once, because occasionally there will be a documentary, but I mean drumbeat coverage of the issue of Medicare for all, right? Of the idea that everyone deserves basic health care, just like we believe in public education. We don't feel that depending on how much money your parents have will determine whether a kid goes to school or not. Why isn't healthcare in the same category? I can't help but think every time the age for getting a vaccine is dropped. First it was 80, then it was 75, then it's 65. In some states now it's 60. In some states it's 55. I have always said when people say, what is Medicare for all? You know, I say, well, we know it well. It's Medicare. It's an extremely successful, very popular program in this country for people 65 and above. Why don't we just drop that age to 0? And then we will all be covered. And every time they keep dropping the age, I'm thinking, why don't they drop the age for Medicare, just like they're dropping the age for the vaccine? And then in a few months, everyone would have health care. But there is a reason we don't get that on the corporate networks. I mean, think about the advertisements every 5 or 6 minutes. It's most often an insurance company or it's a drug company. And I'm not saying they say you cannot talk about this, but I'm saying there's a kind of shared ideology. The reason these corporations advertise on these networks is because they support, essentially, there's a kind of consensus. And at this point, we have to break that consensus because there's a different consensus. And it's actually the view of the people in this country. This isn't a matter of convincing people to do something they don't want to do. Medicare for All is extremely popular, but you'll rarely hear that on the networks. And I'm not just talking about OAN or Fox News. I'm talking about CNN. I'm talking about MSNBC. These are the kind of issues, especially when we're talking about the lessons of the pandemic and what do we have to do? What are the treatments? What are the cures? What are the ways to deal with this? That essentially is perhaps the most important system that could come out of this, is a new healthcare system in this country. And that discussion has to happen, which is why we need an independent media to provide a forum for people to have these debates about these critical life and death issues.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Amy. So now we will be transitioning to the audience Q&A portion of tonight's event. And we are monitoring the Q&A function. So please try to avoid the chat right now and just limit your responses to the Q&A. We've gotten a few questions about our own institution, Johns Hopkins, and their efforts to institute a private police force. So I'm gonna try to combine a couple of those into one question for you. It's clear that this is from Colin, it's clear that through providing a counter narrative to the corporate media biased against them through filters of capital and institutions atop hierarchies, movements are allowed to flourish. While obviously helping these movements, it seems that a large platform is required to counter those narratives. How would you recommend those of us fighting our own campaigns, for example, JHU's efforts to institute a private police force, fight against the biased and often verging on untrue narratives spun by institutions and platforms that would benefit from those police, such as the Baltimore Sun and the university itself, without such a large platform? How did you go about building that platform yourself?
Well, I see Democracy Now! As part of a larger media and democracy movement. And I see issues like you take on in your university. And we have covered what you're talking about at Johns Hopkins. We've also interviewed epidemiologists at Johns Hopkins and talking about this pandemic. I would say that, you know, there isn't one answer, and that's why we need an open media that debates these issues. And I also want to say that the corporate media allows one kind of debate. It is usually, you know, between the right, between Republicans and Democrats, and they do disagree more now than they have in the past. But there is very real debates for example, among progressives and more corporate Democrats. And we want to show the whole span of debate. Because I do think that right now, when you see, for example, what's going on in Congress, that is where the big debates are taking place. You've got the Republicans, you've got the more centrist Democrats, you've got the progressives, and you need to, even within movements, people are hashing out strategies, and we need to have an honest and open discussion about what is the best way to move forward. I can't say, for example, at Hopkins, what is the best approach to take, but what we can do is to provide a forum to have those discussions, so people who are most effective can make up their own minds.
Perfect. Thank you so much. This next question is asked by an anonymous attendee. You've had the chance to speak to progressive juggernauts from Senator Sanders to Noam Chomsky on your program. Which progressive thought leader is the most inspiring for you personally?
Oh, there's not one person. I mean, it's movements that inspire me. It's people organizing together. I mean, whether it's being out at Standing Rock and hearing the elders talk about the importance of the earth and protecting it, not just for Native Americans, but for everyone. You know, I was just interviewing some guests on Democracy Now! From Standing Rock, and they have decided to prioritize the elders who speak Lakota, Dakota, the languages, and preserve the culture, because they understand when the elders die, that the whole culture dies. And that is such a deeply inspiring idea. And it's never about one individual. It is about people standing up together. I mean, when you think about covering the protests in the streets of the Black Lives Matter movement, you know, it's not one person or one leader. It's the power of those voices together. But speaking to people individually, in the rest of the networks, when they cover protest, if they do, or even in the newspapers, they may show a mass protest, but you hear a chant, you hear shouting. We want those people who are in the streets, we invite them into the studios, except for right now during the pandemic, onto Skype or onto Zoom, so that we can all protect each other. But we invite them into the studios so they can have a reasoned discussion, and they're not just background voice. That those are the voices at the center of the movement. So I would never say it's any one person. Though I have to say, I'm very excited that you're going to be ending your series with Angela Davis, and I hope you tell her hello from me. We just recently interviewed her about this historic moment. And, you know, from her decades of activism, does she see this as a seminal moment, which she certainly does.
Wonderful. We will definitely say hello to you for her. Okay, our next question comes from Jessica Mack, and she says, I'll never forget the first episode of Democracy Now! I watched. Amy interviewed Crystal Davis, a Black mother from Texas accused of voter fraud. At the time,
God, of course.
At the time, the story wasn't being told anywhere else. A door opened for me that day. Amy, how do we help others realize the value of independent journalism, and how can we help open this door for others?
Well, I think just, you know, one of the powers of the internet, of course, and one of the powers of social media for good is that you can spread the word, and it's not going through gatekeepers. Now, of course, remember that the internet can be the greatest rumor mill on earth, and those rumors spread fast. But it also is a great democratizing force if used in the right way, where we can horizontally communicate with each other all over the planet. And one of the things I'd say is, you know, let people also know about Democracy Now! Because we link up with movements and with media outlets, independent journalists all over the world. And it's a great roadmap to see about other issues and other movements, and to link and to find all those links that go everywhere else. So let people know about Democracy Now! And democracynow.org as we celebrate our 25th anniversary this year.
Perfect. Next question comes from Rachel. Rachel asks, I live in a Southern Virginia city known as the last capital of the Confederacy. The deep